Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. Thanks so much to everyone for being here. My name is Annika Smith, and I'm an associate professor at Windsor Law and director of the Windsor Law Center for Cities. On behalf of Windsor Law and the Center for Cities, welcome to all of you. And I want to acknowledge before we enter into the day's conversation that I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi people. In particular, as we engage in a conversation about both our federal and our municipal levels of government, are keeping our obligations in mind and keeping in mind those in our community who continue to work for reconciliation and to implement the terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission needs to be front of mind. I want to thank all of our candidates and our moderator for being with us this afternoon and participating. And before I turn the floor to one of our Center for Cities student research associates to say a word about the center and introduce our moderator this afternoon, let me just say a special word of welcome to any youth, and in particular, any first-time voters who are joining us live today or listening to the recording after the fact. A big thank you as well to Rose City Politics, who will be making today and tomorrow's forum recordings available as a podcast, and to our Windsor Law Communications Director, Rochelle Prince, for all of her support, as well as to the campaign teams who are working very hard to fit this event, who have worked very hard to fit this event into a very full campaign. We appreciate all of your collaboration. I'll also note that the Conservative Party of Canada candidate for Windsor West gave his regrets yesterday, so won't be with us today. I'll now turn the floor to Gush Minhas to introduce our moderator for today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gush Minhas, and I'm a second-year law student at Windsor Law and a student research associate of the Windsor Law Center for Cities. The Windsor Law Center for Cities at the University of Windsor was established in 2019 as a venue for supporting research, teaching, and community engagement on the legal and policy tools of inclusive and sustainable cities. You can learn more about our work, including other upcoming public events, on our website at www.windsorlawcities.ca. We are proud to host today's Windsor West Candidates Forum on the Vision for Cities. With that being said, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our event, Rich Garton. Rich Garton is known to many of you as the reporter with CTV Windsor, a position he has held since 2009. During his time with CTV Windsor, Rich has often covered municipal affairs in the city. And as a native of Oakville, Ontario, he holds 2 degrees from the University of Windsor and currently lives in Windsor with his wife and 2 children. Welcome, Rich, and I'll turn the floor to you and introduce our candidates and explain the format of today's forum. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Gush, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me as your moderator for today's debate. I want to jump right into things, so let's start with a quick introduction of our candidates, neither of whom is a stranger to Windsor's political scene. Brian Massey is the sitting member of Parliament for Windsor West, a position he has held since 2001. He is the NDP candidate for Windsor West in this 2021 federal election. Sandra Pupatello served in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario as an MPP for Windsor West from 1995 to 2011. She is representing the Liberal Party of Canada in Windsor West in the 2021 federal election. Now, a quick rundown of the format for today's forum. The first round will feature 4 questions for candidates drafted by the Center for Cities team. Each candidate will be given an opportunity to respond first to 2 of the questions. The order was randomly selected by a coin toss just prior to beginning today. The first speaker will have 2 minutes, and the other candidate will then be given 1 minute to respond. The first candidate may be given 30 seconds to rebut at my discretion. Please respect these time allocations so we don't run out of time to have great discourse. Following the first round, we will take questions from you, the audience. You are invited to use the Q&A function to submit questions. Please keep in mind that questions should relate to the topic of this forum, which is the priorities for the City of Windsor and/or federal issues with a municipal impact. Questions will be selected according to their relevance, the extent to which they ask something the candidates have not already been asked. We anticipate having 15 to 20 minutes for audience questions. Candidates will alternate in order that they are asked to respond to the question. However, if a question has been directed to a specific candidate, they will normally be given the chance to respond first. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond to the audience question with rebuttal at my discretion. Following these rounds of questions, the candidates will each be given 2 minutes to give a closing statement. The candidate who lost the initial coin toss to begin the debate will have the opportunity to speak first. In addition to a live audience today, this forum, as Annika mentioned, is being recorded and will be available on the Windsor Law Center for Cities website by later today. It will also be made available as a podcast by our friends at Rose City Politics, so many thanks to them. Finally, before we jump into the questions, I want to thank everyone for their patience. This is the first time we are holding such a debate via Zoom, and this presents some new challenges. Thank you for your indulgence with any hiccups along the way. Candidates are encouraged to leave their screen view on gallery so they can see me at all times, as I will give visual cues like this when your time is almost up. We reserve the right to mute microphones if time limits are not being respected. Okay, thank you to all, and let's get started. So we did the coin toss, and the first question will go to Brian first, and the subject is housing. A crisis of affordable housing has hit the city of Windsor, like cities across the country. In Windsor, average incomes have remained steady, while the cost of housing has risen sharply in the past year. Both of your parties have released detailed platforms on housing that focus largely on increasing supply and/or placing money in the hands of purchasers. There was little in either platform about housing innovation, nor on exactly how your government would work directly with municipalities like Windsor to get the right kinds of housing built quickly. How can Windsorites be confident that your party, if elected, will be able to deliver on building the millions of units of housing that are needed across the country in an efficient and sustainable way? And what policy changes can you highlight to ensure that both private and public investments in housing remain affordable? Brian, the floor is yours. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Rich, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in the debate today. It's much appreciated. This is a critical issue that wraps around to affordability for Canadians as well, too. And housing, as we've seen for decades, has been a real problem for not only just the city of Windsor, but our country. As a former city councillor, I can tell you I've witnessed our housing stocks suffer with lack of updates and support by provincial and federal governments. In fact, the lack of a national housing strategy has certainly caught Canada by storm in many ways, and Windsor is now affected quite deeply when we even have rental properties now increasing, and we actually have people that are calling into my office who are evicted because they can no longer afford the rents that are taking place, and some of the properties are going up in quite a duration of expenditures. They have no alternatives. One of the things that we want to do as New Democrats is work with municipalities continually to update that housing stock that basically was built for our grandparents after the Second World War. When we saw some of the national housing strategies come out, those units still serve to this day. We want to build 500,000 houses, and these are new builds. That's very important, half of them to be done in the first 5 years. We also want to make sure that, similar to our parents as well and our grandparents, that the housing mortgage rate is extended over 30 years. To kickstart some of the smaller housing units, we need to actually waive the GST, HST, and actually have new home buyers have incentives to actually be able to get into the market. But again, we have to look at some of the houses that are being here in Windsor. You can sell a house for a lot of money, but you can't buy one. It's ridiculous in terms of the expenditures that you'd have to make, and that's what we see people getting squeezed at. So it's a type of housing that we have to build. We also can take federal buildings and have them retrofitted and improved. You look at the Paul Martin building downtown, for example, the facade only got a temporary relief from it, whereas that's one of those ones that we could actually be fixing up. So there's plenty of opportunities if we work together, but it requires good investment. Thank you.
Sorry, Rich, you're muted.
Well, there you go. The joys of Zoom. As you could imagine, I said, Sandra, the floor is yours. You have 1 minute to respond.
Thanks a lot. And I want to say to the people, first of all, good afternoon and good morning. I'm delighted to be here and talking about these important issues that are going to affect Windsor and especially Windsor West. As it comes to housing, I think it's critical. We are like the bellwether of what's happening across the country in all the municipalities. And interestingly, in the pandemic, it's caused this kind of dramatic impact on housing prices all over the world in all of our Western nations. So we're watching this happen, whether we're looking at Nordic countries, the American cities, or in fact here in Canada. What's important is that what you expect you'll get in a Liberal government again after this election is what you've been seeing in these last several years, which is significant investment in housing. And you've seen Ahmed Assam, our Minister of Housing, was down just the other day before the election was called, again announcing more money for more housing. And importantly, the people that are watching today are talking about cities and their interaction with different levels of government. This city actually worked with the federal government for the selection of projects of where that money would be placed. And that's important, and we will get more of that.
Brian, a rebuttal?
Yeah, one of the other things that's really important is remember the speculation that goes on the increased properties that we've had. So the NDP would move immediately on a 20% speculation tax on foreign investment that has been driving up the cost of housing. Those are the things that are really critical because we have artificial inflation that's taking place. And I feel bad for our young people. I know my children are looking at the fact that their housing has become unaffordable, especially when you couple education and the cost of education that's being passed on to them, housing, the cost of even getting into the market with a car, and then finding stable employment is very challenging. So getting rid of the speculation is critical. So a 20% tax immediately we can do. We control that. We can do it. We should have done it already.
Sandra, do you care to follow up on that?
Well, just to say that everyone can see that liberal.ca/housing, it identifies a whole bunch of pieces on a platform for housing, a Bill of Rights for home ownership that protects in that whole bidding process. So you can't have those blind bidding again. So it speaks to a lot of this. And if the real estate agents are having a little challenge with that, that's probably because it definitely benefits the buyer. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, guys. So on to the second question. It's regarding climate action. Both of your parties have been clear in the platforms that addressing climate change, including reducing emissions to slow the rate of the Earth's warming in line with reporting and recommendations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a priority. Reaching net zero emissions and leading globally on climate forums are part of both of your parties' platforms. The data tells us that municipalities emit or regulate 60% or more of emissions, with a huge chunk of this being from transportation. Many municipalities, including the City of Windsor, have declared climate emergencies, passed climate plans and emissions reduction targets of their own, and increasingly use a climate lens or analysis on their own decision-making in all spheres of their responsibility. An example of this is the City of London, which just this week canceled a road expansion project due to an assessed climate impact. Yet, despite strong language on the need for ambitious climate action, neither of your party's platforms embeds climate considerations consistently across the platform items related to municipalities, housing being just one example. If elected, how will your party use the various tools available to the federal government to adequately support municipalities to embed climate priorities in all of their decision-making? Sandra, the floor is yours, and you have 2 minutes.
Thanks very much, Rich. And I think that's a great question. I think the federal government has to lead by example, and that is exactly what happens. Municipalities as beasts actually belong to provinces, and they're a function and they exist because of provincial legislation. So the federal government's role is always through leadership. You'll note things like the $15 wage minimum is for federal employees, but they have to show leadership so that it impacts the other levels of government. And in this too, in climate change, the money they're spending by using natural defenses to fight climate change, when they can show that it works, it encourages other levels to do the same. They've often put those kinds of caveats in funding that goes direct to municipalities, like the transportation fund that comes from the gas tax. So here's funding that never before until a Liberal government did it actually reach from the federal government right down to the municipal level to say, here's money for you, but it must be used for this purpose. In these instances, it's towards public transit. A very difficult conversation when you live in Windsor, because everybody knows we're a car town and it's very hard to get ridership up on public transit. So leadership actually matters. And I think the federal government is showing leadership on infrastructure, on the things that they're funding, on climate mitigation. I hope this isn't the last question on climate change, because our package of work to do is too huge to shove into a 2-minute answer here. And I hope that we'll get another chance, even in rebuttal, to add more to what we're doing to work with municipalities to mitigate and ensure that we do our part in Windsor for climate change.
Okay, Brian, 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you. We've been first actually create a cabinet committee of climate change to ensure that all the actual cabinet positions are looking at this, including those that are supporting municipal initiatives. I think one of the things that's clear is that the City of Windsor has advocated for, we were able to get successfully the first round of funding for flood mitigation, but been turned down twice for the next round. That's very important because there's no doubt that the infrastructure has been challenged with the changing environment that we have. And that's critical because pass on to taxpayers is just not correct. And we also want to reduce our targets and make sure that we're actually going to be increasing accountability. So we want to go back to the 2005 agenda and make sure that we actually reach our targets at 50% by 2030. That's an overall goal that we need to be seeking at. For municipalities, it's going to be more infrastructure money. I was there with Jack Layton when we actually pushed forward and got the gas tax money. We were also able to actually get money for our transportation when we got money for the bus shelter as well too, in the transit situations, and they increased money there. So there's a number of things that we can do because municipalities have official plans that actually deal with this, and that's really an advantage.
Sandra, rebuttal.
Yeah, I don't want to walk down, memory lane too much, but it was actually our Liberal provincial government that started the provincial gas tax in the first place. And it was Paul Martin's Liberals that made it a federal priority. That's the history on Windsor getting a significant amount. And I have to say that Windsor-Tecumseh hasn't had any applications turned down for mitigation funding coming from the federal government. So I demand that Windsor West gets the same kind of treatment, and a voice in Ottawa is actually going to make that happen. Thanks, Rich.
Okay, Brian, any care to follow up?
Yeah, the reality was it was Jack Layton, the FCM, that pushed this forward from the grassroots up. And this is the type of paternalistic approach that we don't want to see when you have the federal governments not listening to the municipalities through FCM. And we've seen what they requested and it hasn't been delivered. We also passed the first climate change act we built in the world. It was the unaccountable, unelected Senate that actually didn't move on this for a number of years. We finally have a climate change bill right now, but it's not sufficient. So we want to make sure that the municipalities are listened and FCM actually gets its due.
Okay, thank you. The third subject for today will be equity in vulnerable communities. The pandemic has shown a bright light on the inequities of our Canadian cities. Like Windsor and other Canadian cities, COVID-19 has hit some communities, in particular Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, harder than others. Several recent tragic events have highlighted that our cities, even our sidewalks, are not safe for all members of our society. Crises in mental health and addictions have skyrocketed here as elsewhere. Much of this falls at the feet of cash-strapped municipalities to address, while reliant on higher levels of government for support. If elected, how would your government work to support municipalities like Windsor to ensure that the needs of our communities most vulnerable are being prioritized? Brian, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. This is a critical question that's actually shaken the nation in many respects, not only just with regards to us here locally, but federally. Long before COVID, municipalities have been downloaded the opioid crisis. This is something that actually should be called a national and a national disaster so that we actually get the appropriate supports. Doing a piecemeal approach is not sufficient enough. And we've known that we've had thousands of Canadians die because we're not dealing with this in the proper way. This is a health issue. This is not a criminal issue. And that attitude needs to change in Ottawa. I would also argue too that the Canada Health Act needs to actually include mental health. It's one of the things that's critically important for us to understand and to realize that issues over housing, issues over addiction, and issues over mental health are actually going to be taken part of the federal government. Our transfers for mental health have dropped from 50% to 23%. So that needs to be included. It's very significant. We've also seen Islamophobia rise its head in Canada, and that's why we need actual laws to deal with this. I've risen in the House of Commons numerous times to talk about this issue and also to advocate for actual laws to deal with this. We did have a report in the House of Commons that was issued in 2019. When I asked my question, I tried to retable that report, and it was denied by the Liberal government, which is unheard of in many respects because new members needed to see the unwritten, unfinished consequences of that report that weren't put forth. So these are things that also involve how we engage our citizens, everything from policing, municipal services, and so forth. And this has been a great download on them. So I would argue that we need to continue to put those into our, not only just our legislation, but our laws and funding, of course, but they have to be backstopped by laws. That's a critical component.
Okay, thank you. Sandra, your response.
Thanks. I think that the Canadian government, that the people have seen over these last several years, you've never seen a larger focus on gender equity, communities of color being represented in government in significant positions. And one of the best things that government can do, frankly, is lead by example. And they've been doing that. And not just that, they're putting their money where their mouth is. They are, even the university, when they talk about these new research chairs that they're going to fund right here at our university, along with the rest in the country, even then, the caveat is to expose more from racialized communities in those roles. So everywhere through the government, we have seen a significant focus on encouraging more diversity across the government. Otherwise, specific items like the Disability Act, creating a specific disability benefit, which we will do if we continue in as the government. If you go through every part of our agenda, you'll see how we approach that. The $10 a day daycare largely benefiting women. So you'll see all kinds of items where we have taken this issue by the horns and we've worked it as a government, and will continue to do that.
Brian, do you care to respond?
Yeah, I've heard the promise of a Disability Act for 19 years, and it's still not there, even though the United States has one. And I would argue, similar to our Officials Language Act, where we actually have responsibilities and laws to ensure that our official languages are respected, I would argue the same is necessary for Islamophobia and other hate crimes. I look at Asian hate that's taken place over the last number of years. It's been terrible to see that type of emergence, and we need laws that actually backstop this. And I was proud that Jagmeet Singh and the NDP led the charge to get the Proud Boys identified as a hate group. That was something we could have done before. And it's the first time we're actually focusing on some of the domestic issues that we have. We have to deal with them. They're here.
Sandra, follow up to that?
Juste, il faut parler un peu les francophones, la communauté. Après 20 ans, un député ici à Windsor, je pense qu'il ne parle pas un mot en français. Et c'est un autre exemple de le leadership que c'est nécessaire de notre député ici à Windsor West. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, Sandra. Okay, we will now move on to the fourth question. And the subject is transportation and transit. Mid-sized cities across the country have been seeking to improve their transit services and support a modal shift from single vehicle traffic to transit and active transportation. Yet the drop in ridership during COVID has presented serious transit funding challenges to municipalities. FCM, AMO, and municipalities across the country have called on the government to implement a long-term, sustainable funding model. The recent increase in gas tax transfers is a good start, but will be insufficient. Given that improved transit is a multi-solve for municipalities responding to transportation equity, as well as climate priorities, for example, what will your government do to help ensure long-term, sustainable operating dollars flow to municipalities like Windsor to ensure transit is viable and reliable? And the first response will go to Sandra.
Thanks, Rich. And this, I think, is really important for Windsor because we have a greater challenge in most communities. Just the way we're laid out with a river at one border makes serious public transportation a challenge. And when you see where the new growth is in Essex County, we know that relationships between Windsor Tecumseh, Windsor and LaSalle, and all of these pilots that we've been trying to do, moving people from downtown Windsor where they might need a job out to the county where we know there are jobs. And that's been a constant struggle. And our government, the federal government's responded to that, not just with direct funding of transportation to be used by the city, but also for other measures like biking and putting all kinds of bike paths right across the city. Some of it a bit controversial where people are losing their parking spots. I get that. But once the bike lanes are there, I can tell you that me on my bike, even I realize I can get from one end of the city to the other now on bike trails, even when I'm going down Dougal Avenue under the overpass there. So I think it's critical to see that you can see the footprint of the federal government all along the way across the city, helping people not just get out of a single driving car, but onto public transportation of all kinds. And we'll continue. The best way to see what the future behavior of the government will be is to look at its past behavior. And we've got a solid track record of funding the city on these kinds of initiatives. Thanks, Rich.
Okay, Brian, your response.
Well, we definitely have to improve the amount of money that's going to municipalities because they actually have a well-designed plan to bring in electric vehicles and buses in particular for transit. It's a regional issue as well too. So we have to recognize the ability to actually provide supports to reach into, say, for example, LaSalle, Tecumseh, and other places. That's critical, and there should be appropriate funding for that, but that's not provided right now. I'd also argue, I mean, obviously, it's clearly the way bike lanes are a national bike strategy with regards to lanes is important. It's one of the reasons we fought so hard to get the bike lane on the Gordie Howe Bridge. And incredibly, the government was designing a bridge without a bike lane and accessibility. We've been able to get actually that to be free from crossing for pedestrians and so forth. And we're also working with the Ojibwe Shores, where we've got the commitment for the Canadian Trails Associations to actually build in the trailing aspects. So these are wonderful opportunities that have to be taken advantage. And I would also argue that too, it's incredible right now, the government is only studying London to Toronto for a new via service that would actually connect into Quebec City. That's the first time Windsor and London have been left out of the equation from any of those studies. And we also even saw most recently, even Amtrak's considering coming across. So these are the types of public education that are necessary that can be successful.
Sandra, I think you might want to respond to that one.
Thanks, Rich. Well, people will probably remember I've got a long history on the train going from Windsor to Quebec City. In fact, when I was a minister, I actually funded some of those studies. And the reality is that the minister very recently, Omar Al-Gabra, was in town specifically to talk about the link between Windsor and Toronto. So it's just not fair to say that anyone is leaving us out. And in fact, if we have a Windsor West voice, a strong voice, nobody would dare leave Windsor out. Let me just leave it at that. Thanks, Rich.
Brian?
Yeah, well, I mean, that just proves the point there is that actually we're left out. And I don't know what it says about Mr. Kripsmerchuk with regards to representation, because that's actually in his riding. But at the same time, what I do want to emphasize is that we don't need any more studies on this. Actually, we need higher speed rail. The investment's great. It's jobs. It's actually cleaning the environment. It's actually stopping urban sprawl. It's been studied and debated long enough. We actually need to act on it, like Uzbekistan and other countries across the world have actually done. So this is an incredible opportunity for us. And I would suggest that we just have to start acting as opposed to studying anymore.
Okay, thank you very much. We're now going to move to the audience question portion of this debate. And I just want to remind everyone that we have one question here, but we're open to having other questions submitted to us. Thank you to Christine Fitzpatrick for submitting your question. I'll read that now, and then in alternating order, I will have Brian respond to this one first. You have 1 minute, and then Sandra, you have 1 minute to respond to that, and then we'll alternate back and forth for the future questions. So the question is as follows, and it's transit related as well. Windsor was once a leader in public transit innovation, being the first in Canada to install electric streetcars to connect our communities until we became the automotive capital after World War II. As of the 2016 census, only 3.3% of commuters in Windsor use public transit as their mode of getting to work, compared to 14.5% for the rest of Ontario. What would you do to help improve our rate of public transit use so that it's comparable to the provincial average? And what overall general public transit funding and initiatives do you support? And I'll say maybe other than the gas tax. Brian.
Thank you. That's a great question. That's part of actually our electric transportation initiative that's in the Democrats that we're pushing for it. And it's a great example. I mean, I lived at University in Elm for years, and that's formerly London Street, now University, that actually had some of the first trolleys in North America. And it's incredible to think that many are even returning that way. And we have the same opportunity. So you're right, the gas tax is one of those elements that we should have as part of it, but it shouldn't be the only one because there's other municipal needs, and we should actually be looking at electric vehicles in there. We also have some incredible manufacturing opportunities we can actually get with the production and the facilitation of those for Canadian jobs. And we see those as together and tied. And that's where we can actually use our domestic procurement that can actually provide that type of incentive and those types of jobs. So this is really incredible. And if we do some of the investments with our patents and our other types of research and development, we can also get some transferable technologies into other transportation elements. Obviously, too, biking, cycling, all those things. Now we see the birds down on the waterfront that people are using. There's more active transportation taking place that's cleaner and greener. We have to jump on that. And then lastly, even for electric vehicles, we need to make sure that we're actually going to have better incentives. So the Chrysler Pacifica that was left off before with regards to the incentive, we want to bump that up to 15,000 so we actually have multimodal participation. Thank you for that question.
Okay, Sandra, your response.
Thank you. I do want to say that this past government alone and its behavior is exactly what we're going to see if we can have a majority government. And it's important. 100,000 Canadians benefited from a $5,000 rebate to buy an EV. And that's important because we do want to include that because we make cars in Ontario, we make cars in Windsor, we need to focus on what kind of car we're making because we're going to get to 2050 net zero emission. And that's important. How do we do that and still not ditch the manufacturing sector that is our life and blood? So these things are critical questions, and what we do about it matters. We've already set out funds to help our automotive industry transition to that net zero kind of a vehicle. And these, by the way, are subsidies that Jagmeet Singh specifically said he's going to ditch. And he said that in Montreal, but did not mention that when he was here in Windsor the other day. And tell me, I'm keeping a sharp eye on that because that dramatically affects our own industry. The question is about how do we encourage public transit? We have to have not just public transit, clean transit. So the scooters you see downtown, That kind of funding that goes to the cities direct from the federal government is critical. And again, the feds leading by example. The bus on the hill is an electric bus, and we want to see that kind of thing continue. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, Sandra. Brian, I think you want to respond to that. I saw you shaking your head.
Yeah, that's not accurate whatsoever with regards to our incentive. It's 15,000. Let's go back and take a look what happened. Every other electric vehicle got the incentive from the Liberal government of $5,000. Every foreign vehicle was getting an incentive, except for the Chrysler Pacifica, when the government launched this program. We fought that tooth and nail, and we won. We did all the work with the plants down here. We worked with the 444. We did the advocacy. I even actually went to the minister's riding to sign up the people from Brampton and Bramalea to support the Pacifica to get actually on the list, and we did that. And we want to bump that up to 15,000, because even when you think about that, the actual Windsor Pacifica minivan is multi-passenger. So it actually provides more of an opportunity to move people together in unison versus some of the subsidies they provided for very expensive vehicles that weren't even built in Canada.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to the next question. And this is from an anonymous attendee. And the question will be to Sandra first. Sandra, how are you personally working to cultivate a culture of anti-oppression? How do you plan on addressing the radicalization of the extreme right and white supremacy manifesting itself into the issues you've named, such as racism, Islamophobia, as well as anti-climate and anti-public health action?
Thanks, Rich. I think that's a great question, because I do believe your local MP has to lead by example. And that means everything we do has to be representative of that. It means everyone around us has to show that kind of diversity. We need to put, when we have the opportunity to hire people, to have people in the public domain that actually represents that kind of diversity, so people can see, yes, those are leaders, no matter what community they come from. And in addition, we have to show leadership on things like the vaccine. In my office right now in the campaign, you can't come into the campaign office unless you've been double vaxxed. And that's a clear sign right on our door. We've done films, we've done ads promoting everybody getting a double vaccine. Again, leading by example. When I go door to door, I've actually filmed a Vietnamese man talking about how people in his country back home are desperate for vaccines, and yet he cannot believe how people right here in South Windsor are fighting and not getting double vaxxed. So we're doing our part to show leadership, but on these questions, what we say matters. What we put out there publicly matters. What we say in our tweets, what we say in our social media matters. And I think when you get that, you can't have, unfortunately, the Conservatives haven't joined us in this debate, but some of the stuff that they've put out on social media is harmful. It's the only word I can use, really harmful. And I think we want to see our government leading the way it has by example. Thanks, Rich.
Brian, response?
Yeah, this is one of the hardest things to face as a member of parliament, and also too as a father of racialized children. It's very difficult to see some of the things that are done, some of the anti-Semitism that's out there, some of the racial discrimination that's out there, the Islamophobia we faced out there. And symbolic gestures aren't enough anymore. We have a report on Islamophobia that was completed in 2019. Long before the hateful event in London, that we have not fulfilled those recommendations. Those are things that should have been and could have been done that we did not do. And this government had plenty of opportunity to do it and refused to budge. I've raised those in the questions in the House of Commons. We've also seen how migrant workers have been treated at times during the pandemic and had to wrestle with some of the states and conditions and the ways that they've actually been treated even before the pandemic, and now becoming much more serious. And so I'm hopeful that many of the things that we have in the future will also be grounded in law. Grounded in law will provide us with more security and more opportunity to follow through and measure our progress on ending some of this and challenging it. That's the key point for me, is grounding some of this in law.
Thank you, Brian. We're going to move to the next question here. This one comes from Kristen Siapas. I hope I pronounced your name right. What will you do to support the live entertainment and performing arts industries that have been hit particularly hard by the pandemic that still aren't back to work and are an essential part of a vibrant economy? Brian, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. That's really important, because we've seen some of those individuals not receive much compensation during this. And that's why, as New Democrats, we fought to increase the CERB from 1,000 to 2,000 immediately, because they also don't show up in employment insurance. Yes, they will pay some employment insurance, and yes, they will actually do their part, but often their hours don't melt with the system that's in place, and that has to change as well too. There's no doubt that the Performing arts and the culture organizations need more direct funding. That's critical as well, because there's going to be some work to be done to put together the proper practices to be safe and actually go back into the different theaters and the different places. And that's why I think it's also important that we work eventually towards some type of commonality across our provinces with regards to a passport or a vaccination document that allows those groups to be able to start performing again. And lastly, when the border does open, I can tell you from the Windsor artists, there's been so many problems about them crossing back and forth in the border to perform. That's a thing to look forward to the future. It's not here right now, but it is something to look in the future.
Okay, Sandra, 1 minute.
Thanks. And the people that I've taken the time to talk to already, not just in this campaign, but that I know that are in this industry, have been very, very thankful. They've been surprised at the level of support that they have gotten from the government, because we always see them sort of separately and out there, but actually they're all small businesses, every one of them. So hopefully people are checking out my social media. Please go and look, because I've actually put information out there, especially for live arts. This government is going to match the ticket sales, because we know we're not quite out of COVID yet. So if there's seating restrictions still in place where they might be performing, those organizations are going to get matching ticket sales. Very concrete help. Never mind the additional of the support on rent subsidies, wage subsidies, the CERB that people are getting when they were suddenly thrust out of work because their organization was shut down because of COVID, and still in some instances hasn't reopened. I think our number one fight still is going to be getting ourselves over COVID. And what do we have to do that? We need a liberal government, a government that will be there for people. I think people realize that government's pretty important. And when there's a crisis, this liberal government was there for people. For students going to our own university with support of $1,250 a month when they lost their job, to people in the creative and performing arts as well. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, Sandra. One more question from the audience. This one comes from an anonymous attendee. And the first responder will be Sandra. So Sandra, how will you work to advance Indigenous self-determination? Will you advocate for Indigenous protected areas in our community?
Well, I think the answer is obviously yes. I can't imagine anybody saying no to that. And we have some very good examples right here at the University of Windsor with the work that our departments are doing directly with Indigenous communities on campus, in teaching. And I think it's embedded in the Liberal platform. If you have a look at the platform, I hope people may have a chance to do that on what we intend to do. There has been more work with Indigenous bands and leaders across this country than in our history. We know we've got work to do on reconciliation. It was this government that actually created the report on reconciliation so that we can now implement those recommendations. And we're working on it. It took a long time to create these problems. It's not going to be over with soon, but we're working on that, even down to the detail of specific mental health support for people from these communities based on what we're discovering in these children's graves across this country. And it's kind of, I'm impressed to see how quickly we're able to move, and we all know we have more work to do. So I'm looking forward to working with our own local leaders to do more of that. Thanks, Rich.
Okay, we have time for one final
Can I get
question.
a chance to respond?
Oh, sorry, Brian. I didn't mean to skip you there.
No, that's okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to butt in either, but it's critically important on this issue in particular, because the Truth and Reconciliation Report is reaching a long time to get done. And some of the basic elements that you think a country, if it was so serious, could have done, should have done, like safe drinking water. How are we still having a conversation about that this day and age, and a commitment from our country to actually remove the boil water advisories? I've seen the burns, I've seen the type of schools, I've seen all those elements that really still have made Canada be well known in the world for not living up to its responsibilities. So we have to start with that for sure. There also has to be full justice. As the graves are discovered across this country, there needs to be full investigative justice as to what took place, who's responsible, and apologies are not enough anymore. Land claim settlements are huge. Down here locally, when I started working on Ojibwe shores, one of the first things I did was consult with the Caldwell First Nations, brought them to the property to look at what was down there and how it was down there and how it fit in with regards to their restorative justice situation, which they've received compensation finally for being left out of the original treaty during the War of 1812. So those elements are also important to be matched with leadership roles that should be enshrined from all of our health services and other types of publicly funded organizations.
Thank you, Brian, and apologies for skipping over you there. I'm multitasking on my end. Thank you for your responses. We have one more question from the audience, and this one comes from Fraser Fathers. He asks, Windsor was home to the highest child poverty in Canada at the time of the 2016 census. Windsor West averages 1 to 2 kids living in low income. 1 in every 2 kids, I believe he means. The 2019 tax filer data indicate we are still likely remaining in the top 5, setting aside the Canada Child Benefit, which has helped support families proportionally across the country. What new measures would you advocate for families who face the greatest need? And the response here will go to Brian first.
Thank you very much. And one of the things that's necessary, and we've seen this being debated many times, and finally some movement, is on $10 a day daycare. It's one of the things that's important to just start with regards to tackling the issue. The other thing is a national food strategy with regards to a number of different inner city areas that don't have the proper nutrition. That's critical to have that type of support so children don't go to school hungry. I see this in my neighborhood in Windsor West, where food programs have become the regular. That should have been the exception, but the reality is we have to support them with a national strategy on that. Obviously raising supports, and right now we need to actually have rental program subsidies, and that's what the NDP is pushing for because of the price of housing. Too many people have to choose between food, medicine, and the rent. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we pushed so hard for the CERB to be increased from 1,000 to 2,000. And thank goodness it was a minority parliament, because that's how we got things done, supporting those budgets that actually translated into results. And as well, that also coupled with the small business improvement fund that we got up to 75% when the Liberals didn't want to do it. That all related to jobs that are important, especially for marginalized working Canadians, and often related to gender issues that are very significant that have to be addressed.
Thank you, Brian. Sandra, over to you.
Fraser, thanks for the question. I know how committed you are to housing, and I can tell you, going around my own neighborhood in Windsor West, we need a strong voice in Windsor West so that the funding that is coming for things like affordable housing actually lands in Windsor West. And that's going to take good relationships with other levels of governments for sure, but also funding that gets directed here. And anybody wants to do a walk down Bloomfield and see those homes that ought to be affordable housing instead of derelict and left for the animals to live in, it's just a real sight that 20 years of a voice from Windsor West has not managed to fix up these neighborhoods, that Forester High School sits there instead of being a hub, captivating people for Windsor West to make it a thriving community, where Sandwich Health Center used to be in that facility and is gone once it got bought out. And so I challenge everybody on this call that the focus has to be on Windsor West. The child benefit, yes, it lifted thousands out of poverty, not just in Windsor West, across the country, but we have a greater pull-up of Canada of the child benefit in Windsor West than in most places in Canada, because we do have this issue. And I was the minister when I funded breakfast programs as Minister of Education when I was a provincial representative, taking care of my own backyard so that we can help these communities. And the same with the kind of investments we saw at Brock, the schools, the new schools, the first children's centers that we put right in Sandwich Town for our own communities in Windsor West. I want to do more of that. I just need to get to Ottawa so we will have that strong voice, not to talk about it, but to actually deliver these very hard, fast deliverables for Windsor West. Our people deserve that in Windsor.
So let's talk about that specific strategy here with regards to what's took place on Bloomfield and also Forester School. That took place because Justin Trudeau and the Liberals have been supporting Matty Maroon and the Ambassador Bridge, including giving him a special piece of legislation in the Order in Council that actually gave them the opportunity to expand their property and expand their footprint. And that was against City Council. And that was against the residents who have fought against this type of nonsense for so many years. They now actually own Forester School. They actually now have bought up those houses. And what did the Prime Minister do? He gave him a special order in council, which didn't even go to Parliament. So if your criticism is about your Prime Minister, then take it to him and do that even without being a member of Parliament, because those are the real things that are taking place right now. they've been rewarded for that type of behavior, which has actually exasperated the situation and problems in that area. And it's interesting because Forrester School was closed by the Liberals.
Okay, 1 minute, everybody.
Thanks,
Sandra,
Rich.
you will have your chance to respond here, okay?
Thank you. I just have to say that when you have a strong voice in your community, you don't let these things fester. You're on top of these things until it gets done. And for 20 years, I asked the neighbors there, when is the last time you've seen anybody helping you with this? And they say never. They just don't see anybody. And all I know is that don't blame who's to blame, fix it. That's what we deserve. Never mind who's to blame, because it's been around for years and years. And I remember well when the Conservative government was there, we had the same problems on those streets. Why? Because we had someone in Windsor West that was not part of the government to actually make it happen. And all I'm saying is, let's try this. Let's just change this for once. Let's see what happens when you put someone in there that does have a strong voice, that has the experience, that's actually delivered for the community. Not talk about it or run in front of the parade as soon as the parade is going our way, then you run in front of it and take credit for it. I can't abide by that anymore. I want to see us actually land solutions for the community. Just like we did with the doctor shortage, we landed a medical school. Just like our patients lined up for London for angioplasty, we brought angioplasty to Windsor. Those are key examples of what happens when the right voice is representing us in Windsor West. Rich, thanks for letting me jump in here, because it's very hard to just sit still on that one.
I know, and you're welcome. And thank you guys for, keeping your composure during this. I know it's tough in a Zoom format because in a room you can get animated. It's difficult in this format, but I appreciate that. We're going to move on to the next question here. How will you lead in climate change adaptation to address the health impacts of climate change in our community? While I understand healthcare is provincially legislated, how will your federal government show leadership to make sure health inequities are being addressed? So I feel like we have two different questions here. So the first question will be about climate adaptation impacts in our community. And I think, Brian, you are up first on this one.
Thank you for that. I mean, there's such a wide range of ways to tackle this. There's the practical that are at our, basically our doorsteps, and then there's the national. Obviously, the national is actually changing Bill C-12 to actually have more enforceables with regards to climate change, and also having a cabinet committee of climate change. So we run all through that process as investments are done. And then there's also the opportunity to look at the economic improvements we can do with the auto industry for making sure that electric vehicles are manufactured and produced here in Canada. Detroit's received the lion's shares of investment versus Canada. And that's got to be something that's going to reverse. And that's why we're supporting the City of Windsor's full platform as New Democrats, with Jagmeet Singh coming down and actually signing off on that right away, and includes none of those components. I'd also point to some of the practical things that we can do that are important for climate change. And one of them is simply Ojibwe Shores and a national urban park. Clearly, having the Windsor Port Authority expecting the City of Windsor residents to pay millions of dollars for property the federal government already has is not sufficient, whereas we have 130 endangered species that can be connected through a series of properties to actually mitigate flooding and also push back against climate change are important. We haven't seen as well action on the $2 billion trees that were announced by the government last time, a whole series of different things. But most importantly, climate change has to be built into our best practices as we go about doing things. Everything from home retrofits to the investments for municipalities, again, going back to transit, all those elements should be part of the whole package for climate change.
Sandra, your response.
Thanks. It's a multi-pronged question, so I'll try to narrow my answer. But on climate change, important things for us: 2 billion trees being planted. For Windsor, that is huge because we are one of the most denuded regions of the country, thanks to some pretty amazing agriculture soil. But we still need more trees. So we want to get on that and get our own communities to jump on the availability of planting trees. $5,000 for EV vehicles. Not just that, but this government has already put charging stations. You could drive from St. John's to Victoria and charge your EV vehicle. That's because this government is making that kind of investment and is doing more of that, and encouraging other governments to do the same, including Windsor. Bike trails all over, 10 urban parks, not just one in Windsor, 10. And it took a Liberal government to actually bring that to fruition. We're going to have at least one new one in every province. We just need to be the government to do that. So there's a ton happening on the climate change side. On healthcare, which matters to us, 75 more doctors and nurses, assistants with being funded to go to school because we need more of them. increasing the wage rate for a PSW worker to $25. If anybody saw the heroes that went to work in this COVID pandemic, those are the people that need our support, and we've got to help them with that. A liberal government will bring these things to fruition. Thanks, Rich.
Brian, I see you shaking your head, so I am going to give you 30 seconds here.
Sure, just one quick example. How hard is it to plant a tree? It's taken 2 years and we still can't put a seedling in a pot to actually plant across this country. And the 2 billion trees aren't even there. That's a classic example of a simple failure. Anybody can plant a tree. It doesn't take you 2 years to plant a tree at your home. It doesn't take you 2 years to plant a tree at your place of business or to do urban renewal projects to help the environment, the ecosystems. We have incredible opportunities with our conservation authorities. We have incredible partners within municipalities that already have all the capabilities put in place. Why can't we even get a tree in the soil after 2 years?
Sandra.
Rich, open question for me. Actually, it's Enercan that's actually doing it, and they've already started with 30 million trees. That's the reality. And we're going
2 billion.
Don't forget that 2 billion trees is our commitment from 2019 to 4 years out, and we plan to do that. I want to challenge Brian. How many trees have you planted at your house?
Actually, I've got 24 actually. Because I planted cedars and actually added 2 new trees to the front. I actually have them in the back as well too. I live downtown, so I did all of those things. So if you want to ask me a question about how many trees I've planted, I live in the city of Windsor on it. I actually have planted those trees. They're in my front yard. I've actually partnered with the city of Windsor. I actually partnered with a number of different groups and organizations to plant native trees. I'm a former vice chair of the Conservation Authority, so I actually went and sought the advice to make sure that they're indigenous trees for our species at risk.
Okay, and Sandra, we're going to throw it back over to you because you were interrupted.
Thank you. I just don't think I should be interrupted like that. I'm not sure you would do that to Rich or any other guy on this.
Sorry, you asked me a question. I apologize.
Now, I want to tell you that if it's so easy to plant a tree, why hasn't our local MP seen that of that 2 billion, we got a whole host of trees down here? If you've got a representative, what their work is that when you have a national strategy, you go and get what you can bring to your city. You don't complain about what you don't get, you go and get what comes to Windsor. And that's what I intend to do. And you know why people know that will happen? Because it's exactly what I did as an MPP. When you see what's available, you go and get what can fit into Windsor, your university, your college, your downtown. That's why we have the kinds of investments we've had. That's why we need an MP with a strong voice, a track record of delivering. Not a track record of complaining, a track record of delivering. Thanks for letting me get my 2 cents in, Rich.
It's okay. Thank you guys. And we're going to move to the final question of today's forum, which will be about political and financial power of cities. Cities have risen immensely in political importance in recent years, yet they remain creatures of the province and are persistently cash-strapped. Unstable funding streams from higher levels of government make it difficult for cities to set and stick to priorities and address the multiple crises at their feet. Calls for more political power, a more direct relationship with the federal government, and more stable funding for cities have grown in intensity. What, if anything, would your government do to improve these challenges faced by municipalities and their relationship with the federal government in particular, while at the same time ensuring that municipalities are working towards and supporting national goals such as climate action? And Sandra, you will get the first turn to respond to this.
Thanks a lot, Rich. And I do think, again, that the best descriptor of what you'll expect in the future is what you saw in the past with this government. When we had a COVID crisis that was hitting long-term care facilities and nobody was helping, it was the federal government that sent in the army to help. And not only that, they've actually jumped over provinces that don't want to be helpful on a whole bunch of fronts, and they're going direct to cities for support. And this is important because you don't always have provinces who want to be helpful or on the same political page as the federal government, obviously. That's certainly the case here in Ontario. So we do have that opportunity. And Paul Martin started that by jumping over the province and going direct to cities on the gas tax. That was the first time they'd ever done that. And now we see that they're being very much more specific on how they're assigning funding to say, you know what, we'll give you more funding in this bucket, but it's only if you're going to be specifically spending more on these fronts. Mental health is a good example of that. More money to primary doctors, more funding for nurses, for example, because we know that nationally, those are the needs out there. So I do think that this government has a track record of working directly with cities. It's why people like, maybe not our mayor who wants to complain about the federal government, but certainly other major city mayors are totally on side with what the Liberal government has been doing. And they're very supportive of the activity.
Okay, Brian, response.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the mayor is complaining about the federal government. I think the mayor is doing what he's supposed to be doing, is advocating for the residents of Windsor and Windsor-Tecumseh, you know, for the connections that we have. And so it's pretty perplexing to criticize those that are actually putting, you know, significant portfolio plans forward that have actually come from municipal discussions. And that's what I like about municipalities, is they have an official plan that includes community consultation. So the mayor's program that he's actually laid out deals with things I think residents are really show respect for, and there's a federal role for, whether it be supporting infrastructure like 80 Knox, or whether it be supporting flood mitigation. Those come from long discussions in looking at where the city residents want to put some of their thought after initiatives, whether it be that, or even, say, for example, healthcare, where the federal government has abandoned healthcare in many respects, going down to 22% of funding nationally, down to, are pushing it back up to at least 35%. And those are things that we've signed on to that are critical, because that shows initiative and partnership, is because the federal government just doesn't have to put it's a paternalistic approach on the cities. What it needs to do is actually listen from the grassroots up. And I can tell you as a city councilor, we did the work in many respects, actually talking to residents on a regular basis and developing the proper plans that then you advocate for. So I think that should be encouraged, not looked down on.
Sandra, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, just quickly. I think Eric is a perfect example. Our MP in Windsor-Tecumseh, he identifies a local need, flooding mitigation, for example, and he's able to bring tens of millions of dollars for flood mitigation into his riding. It's a perfect relationship between the local MP and the mayor and their priorities. And the platform for Windsor looks stunningly like what the Liberal platform has been in assisting cities on every front. And that's why it was so easy for us to sign on and be supportive. So I just want to tell you that my history, my long history, going back with many mayors, but in particular, while I was a minister of the Crown in 3 different portfolios, was working with the local community to deliver what it is they need. They're the ones that gave us the list, and we're the ones that delivered the list. Thanks, Rich.
So, Brian, I'll give you a quick response here, please.
Yeah, so the flood mitigation money came when Cheryl Hardcastle was the MP. I was there for the announcement. And the second and third phase attempts that we've tried are actually been with Eric. So that's what's taken place. And I think it's important to recognize that advocacy and holding to a position that the city has done is something only the Democrats have actually expressed support and unanimity to do that. And I think that's actually good coaching. And I don't mind having good coaching as part of the partnership seeking after these types of investments. And I think that they're coming from the citizens of Windsor should be actually emulated, not pushed aside.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to stop this discussion here because for the purpose of timing, I'd like to give you a chance to give some closing statements. And so on the turn of the coin flip, Sandra, you get to go first for closing statements.
Thanks a lot, Rich. I'm not sure how much time we have because there's a lot of discussion we haven't been able to put out there in terms of a Liberal platform. I'm very impressed with the kind of material we see because of its relevance to Windsor. And I saw one of the questions that we didn't get to, which was the question around $10 a day daycare in the chat. I just want to say that the individuals, the families then can pay $10 a day, and the support between the federal and their provincial partners, they're the ones that pick up the balance of the cost. And it will be critical that we are able to sign on with Ontario, like 8 other provinces. It will be the biggest boon to women, to getting people back in the workforce. Our economy needs the workforce, and our families need affordability. So that $10 a day daycare is going to be key to us. And we know that if the Conservatives win this next federal election, they are scrapping it. They've already said that. And that's why a Liberal vote here in Windsor actually matters. We've got to make sure that we have a Liberal government to deliver the things that we need on affordability, on buying a home, on home ownership, on that kind of assistance, because we see that even in Windsor, catching up to those massive increases that Toronto has long seen. So we know we need this kind of help. But representation in Windsor actually matters, that we've got a voice on the ground so that we actually can deliver solutions. And whether that is the appropriate finishing of the Gordie Howe Bridge, we know we started that heavy lifting with the Herb Gray Parkway, and we made sure that community benefits language was embedded in these things, both at the federal level for the bridge, and in Windsor for the Herb Gray Parkway. And that meant Windsor people got those construction jobs. So the trade unionists were delighted because it's our trade guys that are working on the parkway, on the bridge. And that is something that will give us jobs for many, many years to come, and wealth right here in our own backyard. So taking care of Windsor people is what matters. And that's what I intend to do. I enjoyed the work I did as a member of provincial parliament and finished the list that we had in delivering things for our community. And now there's so many of those items left undone here in Windsor West, and I want to have that opportunity. So I'm just asking the people who are watching today, give us the chance. 20 years of one stripe, enough. Let's just try something different and see what happens. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, Sandra. Brian, your turn to give a closing statement. You have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for coming on today to listen to this, and those that are listening on the podcast later on. It's very important. As your member of parliament, I've been someone in the community who's also volunteered playing hockey and coaching hockey, very much involved as a family person throughout all of my time here. And I think about the days when I was back on city council, because this is what we're talking about, is a city relationship here. And in 1998 was the first public meeting I had with Ron Jones, John Toffenmeyer, and Gary Smith from the police department at Marlborough Public School to fight for border improvements because the province would do nothing. And we fought to actually get a pedestrian countdown clocks and also to get a community safety zone. And that's where we brought forth the idea from Windsor residents for a new border crossing. And I remember sometimes people call that a pipe dream. But we fought several governments along the way, and especially as an MP later on, to actually get the study, to actually get the actual #1 infrastructure project in Canada. I've had success with Liberal majority, Liberal minority, Conservative majority, Conservative minority, and we actually did a really good job together. And I can't think of anything more than even the Herb Gray Parkway, where the city of Windsor had to fight the provincial government because they didn't want to do the right thing. The provincial government at that time wanted to put trucks on EC Row Expressway. And thank goodness Eddie Francis and the city council at that time pushed back. We pushed back against that with the Green Link at that time. And that's one of the reasons actually we have some of the best investments today. And I remember when the province wouldn't want to come forward with the funding, federal funding for a provincials connecting highway, we got 50% federal funding for that when they didn't have to do that at that time because we pushed the case to John Baird and the rest of them to match that funding. And we also got the actual bridge actually completed despite all the governmental changes. And I want to thank the residents for being consistent on that because we didn't fall to the Ambassador Bridge. We didn't fall to the lobbyists and the interest groups that wanted to ram all that truck down our community. And that's why I'm pushing for the future with Ojibwe Shores and a national urban parks. We have our own point peeling the city of Windsor, and it needs legislation. It doesn't need a piece of paper that's a promise. We need the right things to be done. So as your member of parliament, I'll continue to work in Ottawa with everybody to get stuff done like the sports betting bill. I'll work with parties, Liberals, Conservatives, whoever it has to be to bring the results forward. Most importantly, I'll work on behalf of your priorities because your priorities are what you told me at the doorstep for all these years. And you have my commitment to continue them all the way through.
All right, that does it. That concludes today's forum. I'd like to say a special thank you to Liberal candidate Sandra Pupatello and NDP candidate Brian Massey for taking part in this very fulsome debate, very entertaining and informative to say the least. And of course, I want to thank the Centre for Cities for hosting this forum. We'll be back again tomorrow at 10 o'clock for a forum featuring the Windsor-Tecumseh candidates, and that's Cheryl Hardcastle of the NDP and Eric Kuzmarczyk for the Liberal Party of Canada. Thank you, and we hope to see you tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
See you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.